Good morning and welcome today to our webinar. This is one of our webinars as part of our series, our Ask the Expert series from Eurofound, where we try to assess and evaluate topics which are of great pertinence and relevance for the current policy agenda. This particular event is entitled The Rise of the Telework Generation, What Impact for Working Conditions? We'll be looking at remote work, we'll be looking at the rise of the telework situation across the European Union and beyond, and its impact. But for today's Ask the Expert webinar, I'm joined today by two of our key experts in Eurofound in this area. I would like you to welcome with us today Tina Weber and Oscar Vargas.
And it's a pleasure to be here.
Good morning, Oscar. They will guide us through a discussion on this particular issue, on remote work, on how things have changed over the last period, on how COVID-19 has tipped the scale and towards teleworking in a way that we would never have thought possible, and how ICT-based mobile work and working from home is impacting on Europeans' working conditions and their working lives. We'll be looking at the trends of remote work across Europe, and we'll be looking at how workers and employers are making the most of these opportunities and looking at the associated risks. And we'll also be discussing the legislation. So the right to disconnect is one, but not only, and looking at how that will impact and the changes that would be possible in terms of looking at working conditions into the future. So Tina and Oscar and I will discuss this over the next hour, and we hope to give you some insight into this important issue for all of you joining us here today. But we're also joined by colleagues who are behind the scenes. And if you have questions or if you have comments or queries during this period, this current hour in front of us, please do involve yourself. Write your questions in the chat function here, and they will respond where possible. And of course, during this next period, we will also be taking on board the questions that you put towards us. So let's get started this morning. And as I said at the outset, this is really a critical moment for this world of work. We're looking at really wide-ranging changes which have been at play. There's been job loss, there's rising inequalities, there's been a huge impact on young people, on women, those who are in precarious work situations. We know that they've been particularly badly affected. But it's also, with the pandemic, it's also fundamentally changed the way that we work. And I suppose, Oscar, the title of our webinar today talks about the rise of the telework generation. And I suppose my first question would be whether, in fact, there is such a generation. Does this generation really exist? I mean, we know that before the pandemic, there was a trend towards telework already in operation. So are we actually seeing anything different now? Is it fundamentally different from it was previously? Perhaps you can just give us an insight as to where we are.
Okay, Mary, I will try to answer this question. I don't know if we can talk about the telework generation. Which is true is that during the pandemic, if we focus, for example, in the year 2020, a very large proportion of workers started teleworking from home for the first time. So I would talk about an acceleration of the process of increasing number of workers taking up telework. For example, in 2029, overall in Europe, we have 15% of workers that work from home or occasionally or usually from home. And the change has been huge because in 2020, we saw that this increased to 25%, so from 50% to 25%. And we can tell clearly that during the pandemic, 1 in 4 workers in the EU have worked from home, occasionally or regularly. And I think this level of telework could remain in the future. But it is something which is, you ask what is the same, what is different? Well, the same is that if we look at the prevalence at member state level, we see that there is some countries, especially Scandinavian countries, and also some countries in the west of Europe, in the Benelux, mainly France, also Ireland, that they have, before the pandemic, high level of telework in the country, and this remains now. So the countries high level of telework, and of course this is very much related to issues like digitalization, the structure of the economy, and also the culture of work and the regulation in place in these countries. So this could say this is more or less right now the same. What is different and what is important is the growth rate that we saw in some countries. We saw that there was a really hidden potential of teleworking in some countries. We saw big increases in the east of Europe and in the south of Europe mainly, also in Germany, Spain, and Ireland. But for example, Italy, more than double the number of workers teleworking from home on a regular basis. And this is a real pattern, important pattern in most countries. Before the pandemic, most workers telework only on occasional basis, whereas during the pandemic, we see a huge increase on teleworking from home, which became the most prevalent form of telework.
That's interesting, and particularly interesting the differentiation between the different clusters of member states and seeing the changes there. But clearly a very large increase. Perhaps we're not seeing a generation, as you say there, but an acceleration in which has been brought on by the pandemic and has precipitated it further. But I suppose, Tina, can we look a little bit in what way has that happened? You know, is it in different types of jobs? Are there different sectors where we see it? Is it different types of work? Are we seeing a digital divide still evident? You know, is it low-skilled workers? Are they going to lose out as part of this? Can you give us a sort of an elaboration of the kind of impact this has had in the types of telework that we're looking at?
Sure, Mary, and maybe I'll start by picking up where Oscar left off, talking about telework, home-based telework now being the main form, because before we talked about ICT-based remote work, which included high mobile work, which included occasionally working from home. And because of the public health restrictions, we are now mainly seeing home-based telework. So even individuals that might have combined working from home with being very mobile, working between different sites, largely they were no longer able to do that and also had to shift fully to home-based teleworking. So in terms of types of ICT-based remote work, that has been a change. In terms of sectors, I would say maybe there is less of a difference, because there are obviously some sectors where telework is possible and others where it is much less possible. And there you have seen the divide during COVID-19 between the three groups that we often differentiate. So those that were essential workers that had to continue working on the front line, those that were able to telework, and those that were largely furloughed because their sectors were essentially shut down. So that's a new divide. But in terms of the sectors where telework is possible, and research from the Eurofound and the JRC has shown that around 37% of jobs in the EU should be teleworkable. These are mainly things like the knowledge-intensive sectors, finance sectors, ICT, education increasingly, obviously with much learning during COVID-19 being delivered online. But then there are other sectors where that is much less possible. In terms of occupations, I think there has been a little bit of a shift, because what we have seen is that while professionals, managers were more frequently using the possibility to telework even pre-COVID-19, now supporting roles like clerical assistants and so on have also started working from home, where maybe previously managers felt you have to have a presence in the workplace. The pandemic has shown that these kind of jobs are teleworkable as well. And then you have the divide, urban and rural. So when we look at the number of teleworkers, there are much more of them in the urban areas. Now, this is partly due to what Oscar talked about, the transmission of broadband availability. It's also due to the sectors, obviously, that are present in different regions. And you have more high-skilled workers, more younger workers, and more women teleworking. And there you maybe see a little bit the digital divide that still exists. Is there broadband? Do workers have the right digital skills to work from home? So I think what we must make sure is that these kind of divides that have emerged don't become entrenched once telework, remains more common. Even
becomes a norm in that sense. Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting point, because there has been a lot positive said about teleworking and remote working, and particularly during this period, the benefits and the opportunities have been highlighted in a way that we wouldn't perhaps have thought possible. But looking at the drive towards this ongoing remote working, and despite the divides that might be emerging, as you outlined there, Tina, do you think, Oscar, are there signs that in a post-COVID era that we will actually see telework as being the foundation for the way we work?
Well, I think it's difficult really to really predict, how the future will evolve. We see with the pandemic that suddenly a huge change, on the world of work and the organization of work, because more people teleworking. But in my view, and considering our findings in Eurofound, I think that generally speaking, working flexibly with ICTs will prevail, will remain essential part of the world of work in the future. It is also true that we have to consider other factors. For example, the twin transition, not only is the digital transition, but also the low carbon economic transition that can also have synergies to increase remote work and use of digital tools. But just thinking about the digital technologies, this digital technology will develop further. So we will see that more jobs will be teleworkable in the future, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we saw from the Eurofound surveys that workers teleworking during the pandemic, they really prefer, overwhelmingly, they say, we want to continue working in the future, either occasionally, in a hybrid model, or on regular basis, working from home. And this is very important. And also, it is very important to bear in mind that the views of the employers are in the same line. They are mostly happy with the experience in terms of productivity, etc. So I think this way of working will prevail in the future, and it will be a very important component of the work organization. Companies now have necessarily to factor in the fact that people will work flexibly. Flexible meaning in terms of organization of working time, but also in the place they work. And therefore, it will be an important element in terms of social dialogue and the policies, that workers, representatives, and companies have to deal with. So there will be an important component that cannot be excluded from the social dialogue. We are still in a transition era. So this is a transition from traditional office work, standard office work, and standard time and factory work, towards a more flexible form of work. And there, I think, as I said, social partners have a great role to shape the future of work.
No, and as you say, Oscar, I mean, clearly, and the survey, our own survey, Living Working in COVID-19, shows very much that there is a desire to continue working, at least in a hybrid model, in some shape or form, into the future. And if I understand from both you and Tina correctly, from the research carried out, we are seeing that this will become much more embedded in the way that we work in some model into the future. So clearly that has an impact on working conditions as we would have considered them previously. And this is what really we're trying to look at today. What does that mean? What kind of working conditions are we actually talking about? I mean, it's very different to talk about remote working conditions when people are working at home from their bedrooms or their bathrooms or wherever is available to them, and when they would be working from the traditional office, where it's very clear what we refer to when we're talking about working conditions. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we know or what we're measuring when we look at working conditions in a remote era?
In relation to working conditions, when we try to analyze this aspect in remote work, there are 2 or 3 elements that really we can say are specific of working conditions in telework. One is the organization of work. Another one is the organization of working time. And then, of course, the effects that these specific elements in remote work have on work-life balance, for example, or health and well-being of workers. So we have to bear in mind that when we work flexibly with digital tools, we are in a totally different environment. It's not the same as when we work from the office. And this is because we have to know that there are certain elements like accessibility to the tools for work 24/7. Tools for work are available anytime, anywhere, unless you are sleeping or having a nap. Well, you could be also, and this is another element, interrupted by colleagues or the employer, to request to do some work. And this is another important element. And very important, autonomy that workers enjoy when they telework. This is an inherent element to the work environment of telework. The flexibility that we mentioned before, gives you both time and spatial independence, so you can work anywhere and anytime. And even though this might look like obvious issues, they are very important to understand the conditions in telework and the effects that they will have on workers and work organization. Just to one element, in the context of organization of working time, what is different from what could be somehow different from standard office work or working in a factory? It is the flexibility. Also, working time becomes more irregular. You don't work, you don't have a shift, morning shift, night shift, but working time becomes more porous. By porous means that at one point you might be working, another point doing some social stuff with the computer, etc. So working time is porous. There is porosity, and it is very difficult to really understand, with the past mindset when we have, from 8 to 2, from 4 to 6, for example, in the evening. So it's different. So we have non-standard working hours, blurring of boundaries, etc. Yeah. This will have implications from, say, work-life balance, health, and the hours we work. Yeah, another second element that I want to highlight, it is that not having a fixed workplace and a workplace which is not under the supervision of the employer makes a huge difference in terms of health and safety, for example. Yeah. I want to highlight only 2 aspects. One is the physical work environment, to have the proper desk, proper room, but also the ICT tools. We see in our surveys that this is an issue. So, workers report that they don't have some workers don't have the adequate equipment, and also that employers sometimes don't provide the right tools for working from home. And another issue is the risk prevention, the action to prevent risks for health at home. Because, of course, at the workplace, the employer is responsible for that and can carry out the risk assessment, check everything is okay, so that you are in a right condition to telework.
Sure.
And finally, one issue that we shouldn't forget is the transnational aspect. I mean, nowadays, workers, and this is important at EU level, can work from any country in Europe. We have to see what is the implications for working conditions. But
well, Oscar, that's a very good point here, because one of the questions that comes in from Lorcan is, could we talk a little bit about telework from another country? It's already happening across Europe because of travel restrictions due to the pandemic, but shouldn't we be extending this flexibility into the future? So I think you're raising that question here. I'm not sure that we can respond to it per se, but I think your response there, Oscar, indicates that this is an issue which is on the table for the future to be discussed and in some way resolved, particularly within a European Union context. Also looking here, two questions from Rita, which are relevant to what you're talking about here, Oscar, and also Tina. What about teleworking impact on working conditions such as autonomy, which is seen to be positive, and the increased amount of processes, so overload and ergonomic aspects, and also the intensification and extensification of work. Is it associated telework, and such as how to prevent it? So, I mean, you know, we will look at some of these issues as we carry on through this, but to keep that in mind in terms of responding to those questions also. But I'd like to move on to just here, specifically in terms of the working time. That was one of the areas of working conditions that Oscar has referred to there, Tina. I mean, also work organization, work-life balance, psychosocial risks that he talked about earlier. But here we're talking about working time. I mean, do we know how telework specifically has been impacting on working hours? And can we see differences between workers who are teleworking and those who are still based in the traditional office context? And can you tell us what the implications of that could be? And particularly here, Tina, we know and we've heard a lot about the work-life balance and the impact on women in particular. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, Mary. And it's really quite striking. I mean, Oscar referred to the porosity between work and private life. And this really manifests itself when we look at the evidence that we have about the expansion of working hours for individuals who are teleworking. So, and this isn't a COVID impact. I mean, the European Working Conditions Survey from 2015 already showed that individuals working from home are twice as likely to exceed the 48-hour working time limit that in principle exists in EU legislation, and are also much less likely to be able to avail of the 11 hours of a daily rest that they are supposed to have access to. In addition, when we ask about individuals working in their free time, about 30% of teleworkers say that they are relatively frequently working in their free time, and that compares to only 5% of those who are based at the employer's premises. And with the more recent Living, Working and COVID-19 survey that Eurofound has carried out, these findings from 2015 have really been confirmed. So there are strikingly more individuals who are teleworking who are saying that they're working in their free time in our survey. That was 25% compared to below 10% of those who are still on the employer's premises. And that is a concern, obviously, from the health and safety perspective, but also in terms of employee rights. When these working hours are potentially not monitored, they would potentially necessarily also not be paid. So this leads to an increase in unpaid overtime. And you refer to the gender impact, and that is very important, because we also know from our own surveys and other surveys that women still continue to bear the brunt of caring responsibilities. They do the majority of household work. So when you see this inflation of working hours, it puts more strain on women's work-life balance. It makes them potentially less likely to be able to do these additional hours that are considered to be required, which could then have a knock-on effect on their career. And we've seen it again in our Living, Working and COVID-19 survey. When you look at the impact on mental health and well-being, women, particularly with small children working from home, are more likely to say that they are struggling to combine work and private life, and that this is really impacting their mental health. So yeah, the working hours inflation is a really serious issue to be tackled in relation to telework.
And I know I'm just going to jump on straight away here to the measures that we could take to address these issues. We've dealt with the work-life balance. We know that there are mental health issues which are being caused also by the intensity and the working time issues. But I would like to also look at how can we tackle these issues. What kind of measures are there already in place at EU or at national level, and are these fit for purpose? Can they address the accelerating changes that we're seeing in terms of teleworking? And I'll put that to you, Tina.
Yeah, I mean it's really important to note that we are not starting from a blank slate. So there is already relevant EU legislation in place. There are relevant EU social partner agreements. So most importantly, we have the Working Time Directive that I've already mentioned, which sets the maximum limits around working hours and requirements for minimum rest. We have the Occupational Safety and Health Framework Directives, which require employers to carry out risk assessments. And that includes psychosocial as well as physical risks, and doesn't just cover the physical employer's workplace. So that should also cover working conditions in the individual's home. We have more recently the directive on work-life balance, which is yet to be transposed at the member state level. And similarly, the directive on transparent and predictable working conditions, which when it is implemented at the national level will require employers to issue written documents to employees stating what their working hours and their working conditions are. So these could have down the line an impact. In addition to that, we have from 2002, so quite a little while ago, a European cross-industry social partner agreement on telework, which is very important in this context. And then from 2020, a European social partner agreement on digitalization, which also touches on the issues of the modalities of connection and disconnection. So we have a legal framework. In addition to that, there are a number of court cases. So there is case law that shows that some employees have successfully challenged where their employer has asked them to work all the hours, shall we say, and they have been able to get compensation, but that relies on the individual employee in a way to have the resources, the backing, maybe from a trade union, and the courage to confront their employer and say, this is not okay to be contacted at 11 o'clock at night and to be asked to have something ready for the next morning. So that, shows that what we have could be used, but the data that I've just talked about also shows that huge problems still remain, so that there are still issues to be addressed. So you've mentioned at the beginning the discussion around the right to disconnect, which has arisen at the EU level now that there is a proposal from the European Parliament. It's worth noting that there are a number of member states that already have a right to disconnect within their national legislation, meaning that in that sense, there isn't a level playing field between EU countries. So we have Belgium, we have France, we have Spain, and we have Italy that already have a right to disconnect on their statute book. And in the discussion that we have at the moment, there is a lot of debate around the tension between the primacy of collective bargaining, of social dialogue, shouldn't it be up to social partners to negotiate on this issue? And I think everyone is in agreement that that should be the case. But I think we also have to consider that when social partners solely are asked to negotiate on this, there are countries where the industrial relations tradition is maybe not as strong, where collective agreements play less of a role. And what happens then? What happens if there isn't a sectoral or company level agreement? Do we need some kind of fallback option that ensures that there is a right to disconnect?
Yeah. And that's checking in here to a couple of the questions that are coming in on this particular issue. One from Fernando, who's talking about the industrial relations to deal with the issues here. Could you talk a little bit more about the compared empirical evidence of the role of industrial relations addressing the regulation of the conditions of telework during the pandemic? So that's one particular. And then two from Nils, who are also dealing with the right to disconnect. Do we need more legislation regarding telework now that it has become more common, a new framework agreement? And you referred a little bit there to that already, Tina, in what you were saying. And then a follow-up from Niels also on, do we see changes in the telework regulation in different countries? And you referred a little bit also to that. But I wonder perhaps, just to follow up on that, Oscar, did you want to look a little bit more here about the response there on the role of industrial relations and in terms of the role of the social partners in this?
Well, I think the role of social partners, as Tina mentioned, in relation to regulating telework and the right to disconnect is very important. And I think it's very important mainly at a company level, because there is a company level where this new legislation, especially talking about, we are going to focus on the right to disconnect, an issue that we have researched very much in the last year. I think the legislation on the right to disconnect leaves the social partners to negotiate the specific terms to implement the conditions for the right to disconnect. So it is, and it is the only way to really address the issue, because companies differ from size, activity, and cannot be the same right to disconnect in a factory producing cars than in a research agency, for example. So very important that the social partners address these specificities. The only issue I have to highlight here is that collective bargaining and social dialogue is not developing at the same, to the same extent in all the EU member states. We see that there are some parts of Europe where the social dialogue at sectoral level, for example, is weak, and this has to be, encouraged or develop more, with the support of the EU, for example.
And there, I think, Tina, we've heard some talk there at company level specifically about how to ensure an effective implementation of these kind of, these papers, if you like, or the soft and the harder approach at company level. Can you talk us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Mary. And maybe the first thing I would note there, following up from what Oscar said, in the countries where there is a right to disconnect in legislation, the first thing that we have seen is that there has been a real increase in the number of sectoral and company level agreements on the right to disconnect. So clearly legislation can be used to encourage social partners to take action. And we have been particularly interested in what actually happens at company level, because there is so much emphasis, as you say, on that this should be done at company level. And we've had a look into a selected number of companies, seeing what kind of texts are actually negotiated at that level. And I say texts advisedly, because they're not always collective agreements. Sometimes they're joint declarations, sometimes they are policies. Usually they are jointly negotiated. Sometimes they're also simply formulated by the employer. And I think that's important to note because it can make a difference in relation to how it's monitored, how enforceable it is, or might there be sanctions associated with it. So that's the first thing. You spoke about hard and soft approaches to disconnection. And yes, those are the two main ways, I would say, of implementing the right to disconnect. When we speak of hard disconnection, we usually speak of systems whereby the connection between a server and email delivery, text message delivery is severed, let's say after 7 o'clock in the evening until 7 o'clock in the morning. So this decision on, my manager has texted me, do I need to respond to this now, is taken out of the hands of the individual worker. I would say that is the lesser used approach, partly because, particularly in multinational companies, there is sometimes the need to work across time zones, making it more difficult to implement this kind of disconnection. You also hear from workers themselves that they would like to take a little bit more time out of the day to do other things and then work again in the evening, and maybe such a disconnection might hamper their ability to work this way. So the most used way of implementing the right to disconnect, I would say, is a soft approach, which tends to focus on awareness raising, on training for workers and for employers, on setting, managing, should I put it this way, out of hours connection. So usually an email is sent saying, if this message comes in out of hours, don't expect it to be responded to, that kind of thing. What I would say, and it's my final point on this, the problem with a lot of these agreements is that the requirements around monitoring and evaluation as to how this actually impacts working hours and workers' well-being tends to be quite weak. So, sometimes there are requirements to have employee surveys, sometimes working hours are monitored specifically, sometimes email traffic is monitored, but we know very little about how this actually impacts employee work-life balance. So I think what we would need to see is much stronger provisions in such agreements around monitoring indicators and follow-up, and ideally joint follow-up between employers and workers.
Certainly more research on that particular area also. I'm also, it's interesting because taking what you're saying there, Tina, and moving it forward, there is a question which has come in from Tiago, which is, what is the substantial, difference between the right to disconnect and the enforcement of the good old work timetable? Aren't we rebranding something that actually already exists to some degree? And maybe Oscar, you could move that forward, because looking at the right to disconnect as being the answer to these challenges, I mean, is it actually, is this the right response? Is it's going to cover the comprehensive challenges that we face? Is this the answer to our problems?
Well, I would say that partially yes. Of course, it will not solve all of the issues related to remote work or the organization of working time or working long hours that Tina referred to. But I think we have some evidence that this can contribute to improving conditions, especially in relation to working time while working remotely. And one thing is, one issue that Tina already mentioned is that we observe that in those countries with legislation on the right to disconnect, the number of agreements, either at both at company and central level, have increased dramatically in few years. One clear example is France, because we have very good data about quality agreements in that country, and we see how has increased, year by year after this legislation on the right to disconnect was passed. Another important aspect that we see both at national level, but probably mainly at company level, is that having this opportunity to negotiate about the right to disconnect help to have a cultural change in the company around how we work, how long we work, what is the organization of working time. So both employers and employees are aware of the problems of working remotely in relation to working long hours, being available all the time, etc. And then they are conscious about this, and they change really the behavior on that. So in that sense, it's not only the increased number of collective agreements, but also the cultural change. So something changes. And this is linked to the question of Thiago. My third point, the right to disconnect can help to enforce some existing legislation on the working time that we have really observed during the last 4 years that is not being properly implemented in the remote work context. We saw that up to 30% of those working regularly from home report working more than 48 hours a week. This was before the pandemic, but it has been confirmed during the pandemic. So my point is it helps, but of course, I think we need more comprehensive approach in terms of policy making and regulation, and understand other aspects of telework and working conditions that can lead to these problems of long hours, etc. And here I refer, for example, some point that Rita raised before about the workload. Of course, addressing the workload is very important. Issues around autonomy, how is used this autonomy, etc. So there are other aspects to be, for example, registration of working time, to register the actual working hours could help also. So it's not only about the right to disconnect. I think we should have a more comprehensive approach. Another important issue to make successful policies on the right to disconnect is the issue of coverage. Okay, we see so far that there are some countries with legislation on the right to disconnect. There are some countries where there is some collective agreement on the right to disconnect, but clearly not all workers in all countries are covered by the right to disconnect.
Sure.
We have countries that we didn't even found in Europe, I'm talking about European level, any agreement on the right to disconnect. So we see now a situation very diverse and uneven in Europe. Countries where there is in the legislation the right to disconnect, so it has to be enforced, encouraging social partners to negotiate through the social dialogue at company level. But then we have countries where there is no right to disconnect. Here comes the issue of, should European employees in the European Union have the same standards, minimum standards in relation to the conditions of work in remote work, including the right to disconnect? And here is where policymakers start thinking, or some stakeholders, social partners thinking whether is needed some EU level action.
Sure.
Could be through adapting previous social partners agreements on telework, could be through legislation. So this is the debate now, and where policymakers are really doing something and negotiating about this at EU level.
No, and that's a critical part of the debate, because it's clearly not simple, Tina. On the right to disconnect, it's an initiative which is important, but it's not covering all the bases. And it's not tackling perhaps all the other tensions which are also arising. And we've a couple of questions here about monitoring and work surveillance and performance, assessment and evaluation. And perhaps you can talk a little bit towards that. There was a question from Thiago about the surveillance in framework of telework, from Diane, where she's talking about the distinction between monitoring and performance in the telework generation as distinct from before. And I think here, maybe if you can just talk us through a little bit, are we in danger of thinking that one size fits all, or having a sort of an ad hoc approach to these issues as they emerge? What's your feeling?
I'm not sure that we're having an ad hoc approach. I see that a lot of our listeners or people following this webinar are interested in the issue of surveillance. And of course, with working from home comes a different way of having to record individuals' working time, of controlling their performance and their output. And it was interesting, I think it was last year or the year before, we looked specifically at a national level regulation and whether in the requirements around the monitoring of working hours, there were specific provisions at member state level on how working hours of teleworkers and remote workers were to be monitored. And I think there are only about 9 countries that make specific provision around how you monitor working hours of teleworkers. And so what we have seen is that as a result of more people working from home, many employers have started to introduce new kinds of surveillance systems, which in many instances are quite troubling. You know, systems taking regular screenshots and making sure you're there working in front of your computer, recording keystrokes, things like this. So that's concerning, of course. We have some provisions already around the protection of personal data, and I would say more research is needed on this, but in principle, an employee would have to give permission for these kind of systems to be used. Now, whether this is always transparent, if something like this is used or not, it is not clear to me. Also, does an employee feel under pressure maybe to consent to the use of such tools? Because, you know, it might be a take it or leave it a kind of scenario. So this is definitely something that needs to be looked at seriously. It's worth noting that in the proposal that the European Parliament has made on the right to disconnect, this issue is specifically considered, which is why I'm saying to you, Mary, I'm not sure that we're taking too much of an ad hoc approach. I mean, these kind of considerations are in the proposals that are being made. And the other thing I would say is that one of the key considerations we have to have looking into the future with a more hybrid way of working is that we need more training for managers around how to manage a remote workforce. Oscar talked about the importance of considering workload, and there is some research from Germany that shows where individuals who telework work significantly additional hours, this tends to be due to workload. So we can't consider the right to disconnect without considering what are the factors that mean that an individual puts in additional hours. Is it pressure they feel from their managers? Is it workload? Is it maybe a lack of certain digital or other skills that might also need to be addressed? I would just briefly reflect that in the case studies that we did and in the agreements that are made in those companies, very often there is a lot of reference to the need of training and awareness raising for employees. You know, saying, you must be aware of your own health and safety. You must learn how to disconnect. I think that's really only one side of the coin and risks putting the blame on workers, whereas this is really also very much a management issue.
And of course, the other issue that's to the fore here is trust. And we know that trust is permeating every discussion we're having at every level on every policy issue. But But trust is really fundamental here between employers and employees in terms of making sure that this kind of remote working situation continues effectively and efficiently into the future. But I'd like to take some moments just right now to run through a couple of the questions on working conditions impacts. There's one from Antonio. What is the impact of telework on social interaction? The danger of isolation and loneliness of teleworkers. Teamwork is more complicated and could be less fruitful in terms of innovation. Do either of you want to respond on that? Perhaps Oscar, do you have a word to say on that?
I have a word to say on that, yes. We actually found through our online our online surveys, when we ask about feelings of isolation related to work, really a higher percentage these issues reported by workers working remotely. So it's really an issue that has to be addressed. I mean, telework is not all perfect, of course. It's not, let's say, it has disadvantages. We mentioned some of them, like long working hours, this issue of isolation. And I think these are issues that really has to be monitored in the future, because I think this telework will continue to stay here, of course, even at the same levels that is now, probably more on occasional basis. But yes, I think this is an important issue that should be, addressed by at company level, by social partners, because it's going to be here to stay. But anyway, I just want to also say that I think the experience of teleworkers during the pandemic has been more positive than negative. The overwhelming majority of those teleworking would like to telework in the future. So there is this issue of isolation. There are others has to be addressed. And so now there's a lot of work for HR departments, how to organize work, etc. But it is not by chance that both workers and employers like the benefits of telework. And I just think that policymakers have to use this as a window of opportunity to improve workers' well-being in the European Union.
And I think, that of course is very important, and that's the focus of the discussion for the most part today. And of course we have our company survey, which looks at the company aspects of that, and we'll have follow-up research on the impact of COVID at the company level specifically. But there is a question from Jan here, which says, yes, if we move on from the individual, surely it is company culture, teamwork, work organization at company level that's really going to be, critical to us being able to tackle the whole issue. And maybe Tina, do you want to say a quick word to that before we come towards the end here?
Sure. And the issue of teamwork also came up again in the case studies we carried out, because a lot of the time the question around availability, how individuals who are teleworking organize their working hours specifically, was agreed around the requirements of the team. So to make it possible to still have effective working within that team, it wouldn't then be possible for someone to work entirely outside of those hours that maybe the rest of the team is working. So that's important. There is also increasingly discussion around if people do not physically meet as often, how do we keep up, innovative thinking? How do we make sure that these aspects that spark when we meet in person aren't lost? So I think those are really important things for managers to be considering into the future. You mentioned the European Company Survey and the follow-up studies that we've done. And I think what is interesting there is that these have shown that HR departments during the pandemic have dealt so much more with issues around mental health and well-being, and introduced specific initiatives to ensure mental health and well-being among a remote workforce. So I think we're already seeing that shift, and I think that the companies that have introduced that during COVID-19 will, kind of be one step ahead in having something already in their arsenal when people continue working more and more in this way into the future.
No, absolutely. And I think with reference there quickly to the question from Anna on the measures that could be taken for those working in highly competitive environments to actually disconnect, I think, again, stay tuned in terms of the work that we're carrying on at the impact at company level and how teams can respond to that. But we're coming to a close now, and very quickly, Tina and Oscar, we've looked today at a wide range of issues related to remote working. We know that we're going in that direction, not only because of the pandemic, but because of the twin transition also of climate change and digitalization. We are looking at more hybrid working, more teleworking. So this is a triple challenge facing policymakers. If you had one message, and I mean one message, to the policymakers facing this triple challenge for workers and working conditions into the future, what would it be? Oscar, if you'd like to start, and Tina, you wrap up there.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, I think policymakers now have a window of opportunity now we're talking about working conditions, to improve working conditions of workers in general, and not only those from remote work. And I think all these trends, the low carbon economy, etc., have to be used to really go in this direction of improving working conditions of workers. I just want to highlight one aspect in relation to telework. It is the huge potential that telework has for improving work-life balance. I mean, this has to be addressed by policymakers so that this really is happening. The potential of telework for improving work-life balance is taking effect and not and avoid, the issues that were mentioned before about. A highly competitive environment and the consequences that telework has in this context, where autonomy is used to sometimes by the worker to really work longer and work harder. So we shouldn't forget these aspects. And as I mentioned, I think there is a window of opportunity. I think we need also face-to-face social relations at work, because we need that. It's in the nature of the human being, but this has to be combined with working flexibly and remotely, because this is something that we find that especially workers, also we found in our online COVID-19 survey that the overwhelming majority of workers teleworking are satisfied with the experience of teleworking.
Okay, thank you, Oscar. Tina, can I get you to give your final message?
Sure, and I mean, I would primarily echo what Oscar is saying, that this is an important opportunity, and I would maybe highlight the opportunity to really strengthen social dialogue on these issues. We have European level framework agreements on telework and digitalization. The digitalization agreement is now to be implemented at the national level. So social partners really have a requirement or a call upon them and an opportunity to negotiate. I would still say, let's be careful. Let's invest in capacity building in those countries where maybe industrial relations are not as well developed. But let's be careful that those sectors, those countries do not lose out in relation to workers' rights. And here, we must really consider whether it is ultimately necessary at the European level to set some kind of minimum standard, some kind of fallback, that if social dialogue fails, there is still something there to guarantee the rights of workers.
Thank you, Tina, and to ensure that we indeed leave no one behind. So thank you both very much for joining us. Thank you to our audience today who have been highly active on our chat room here. Thank you for your questions. I point you to the information that we have online on our website, ongoing on all of these issues. We have a digital flagship report which will be published this year. Please access that for further information on all our digital related research and findings. Continue to sign into our Ask the Expert series, which is ongoing throughout the year. And we look forward to our Foundation Forum, which will look at some of the issues towards recovery and resilience for the European Union, which will take place in November. Thank you to my colleagues for their work behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.